Hello and welcome to this video on long-run aggregate supply. In this video, we're going to look at what is meant by long-run aggregate supply, the factors that influence the long-run aggregate supply curve, and lastly, two different views on the shape of the long-run aggregate supply curve, the classical view and the Keynesian view. Let's start off with what is meant by long-run aggregate supply and how it differs to short-run aggregate supply. So long-run aggregate supply represents the potential maximum level of output in the economy. So how much could potentially be produced, the maximum. Whereas short-run aggregate supply tells us in the short term, what is the relationship between price level and the quantity that could be produced. The long-run aggregate supply curve or concept tells us what could be the potential maximum level of output in the economy. So it's very similar in concept to the production possibility frontier. The production possibility frontier shows us the maximum combination of goods that could possibly be produced in an economy. And if we are producing at that maximum level, say point B, we would say the level we are producing at is the same as the potential level of output in the economy. If we're producing within, like point D, we would say the economy currently is operating within the long-run aggregate supply potential. It's operating at a level of output less than the potential level of output in the economy. So what might influence the potential level of output in the economy? Well, four broad factors might be the level of productivity. So how productive are the workers, the output per worker, and how productive is the machinery? So what is the efficiency of the technology that we are using? The higher the level of productivity, the further out or the greater the potential level of output the long-run aggregate supply would be in the economy. How much labour is there? So the size of the labour force. And if there is increased labour market participation through maybe women joining the workforce latterly or increased immigration, again, that would probably increase the long-run aggregate supply potential of the economy. Gains from innovation and enterprise would make the economy potentially more competitive or have better technology, which is likely to increase the potential that could be supplied. And finally, the level of capital investment. So investment from either overseas or maybe the public sector or maybe from businesses themselves into new capital, technology and machinery and so on. That investment would enable more to be produced and so would again cause an increase in the level of long-run aggregate supply. So a quick summary of what might cause shifts in the long-run aggregate supply. Well, these shifts may come from changes in the labour supply, as we mentioned before, more people joining the labour force. Changes in the stock of capital, so may be affected by the level of gross capital investment. Changes in the efficiency of the allocation of factor inputs. So for example, shifting resources from rural to urban areas, maybe labour is more productive in an urban area than a rural area. That would increase the potential level of output. Improvements in quality of the factors of production, advances in technology, and maybe improvements in institutions such as the banking system, enabling more investment to take place. So we've looked at what is meant by long-run aggregate supply, and we've looked at the factors that influence the long-run aggregate supply curve. We're now going to move on to quite a tricky topic here, where we're going to look at two different views on what the long-run aggregate supply curve actually looks like. And we'll start off with the classical view and then look at the Keynesian view. You may want to rewind these sections and go through them again, but the key factor we need to take away is that we know the different shapes of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So let's start off by looking at the classical long-run aggregate supply curve, and we'll look at how this is derived and the thinking behind the shape of this curve. So again, we have the same axes. We have price level within our economy, and along here we have the level of output, real GDP. And let's imagine our economy starts in this position. We have aggregate demand within our economy, aggregate demand curve A, and we have short-run aggregate supply curve A as well. And this means our economy would be in equilibrium at this position here. So at this price level and at this level of output, and we'll call this level of output Y1. Now what we're going to imagine now is that actually the current level of output Y1 is different to what the potential level of output would be. And we're going to say the potential level of output might be YFE, where FE stands for full employment. So this tells us what output, real GDP, could be if we fully used all the resources we have available. So this is very similar in concept to the PPF. This level of output over here to the right represents the level of output you would get on the edge of your PPF. Now what we can see straight away is that this is the level of output using all our resources, and this is the current level of output. So what that implies is there are some spare resources, some underutilized resources in our economy. Now, if you have spare workers and spare machines and spare materials, what will happen to the price or the cost of those workers' wages, the price of cost of those machines, the price of cost of those materials? Well, those factors of production would probably go down in price. And if they go down in price, it lowers the cost to businesses. And if the cost of inputs to businesses are lowered, we would very quickly see a reduction in the short-run aggregate supply curve. And so that the level of output through the reduction in price would increase to YFE. So the economy will quickly adjust from this position to this position. Let's imagine a different scenario now. Let's imagine that actually the level of aggregate demand in our economy was here, AD curve B, and we were on AS curve B as well. So our economy is here at a level of output Y2. Now in this situation, we are using our resources to produce a level of output that is unsustainable. It's much higher than the full employment level of output. Because this is a sustainable level of output where we use our machines regularly and maintain them. We use our workforce and give them breaks. Whereas this one here, actually, we're pushing them too hard. If we do that, if we produce too much, then the cost of workers, if they're being overused, there's too much overtime, will start to rise. The cost of machines will start to go up because we need to replace them because they're breaking down. In that situation, the costs would start to rise and our economy would, the AS curve would shift up and move us to this position here. So what we can start to see is that whenever we're either side of this level of output, prices will start to adjust for the factors of production, and that will force us back to this level. So when we were here, prices adjusted and we were forced to here. When we were over here, prices adjusted and we were forced to here. So there is constant pressure within the economy to use all the resources available. And so in the long run, once these adjustments have taken place, we should always be at a level of output that corresponds with the full employment level of output. So the classical long-run aggregate supply curve looks like this. It is a vertical line which indicates that in the long run, the economy should always move to producing the level of output that is consistent with fully using all our resources. So the classical economists were a group of economists who believed that the macroeconomy always adjusted rapidly to the full employment level of output. They believed that the labour market and other markets for the factors of production adjusted quickly, so workers will adjust their wage expectations and accept lower wages, there'll be no resulting unemployment, and the economy will always move to the full employment level of output. So this is our long-run aggregate supply curve. And we can see that in this situation, in the long run, aggregate demand, the level of aggregate demand will only influence the price level rather than actually the level of output. So if the economy always converges rapidly on full employment level of output, no manipulation of aggregate demand can have any effect except on the price level. So the belief behind this long-run aggregate supply curve is that movements in demand can only affect the price level in the long run. They can't actually affect how much is being produced. That can only happen due to changes in supply. So if there was an increase in aggregate supply, there will be an increase in GDP. but any increase in aggregate demand will only change the level of prices, won't actually increase how much could be produced. Okay, let's move on to the Keynesian view now. So this was a view from an economist, British economist called John Maynard Keynes, and he thought in the long run, the aggregate supply curve behaves slightly differently. And here is his take on what the long run aggregate supply curve looks like. So he thought it was an L-shaped curve that got steeper as you got closer to the full employment level of output. So what are the implications of this and how is this derived? Well, when there is a low level of output in the economy, there is lots of spare capacity. And Keynes believed that when this was the case, that the AS curve was likely to be highly elastic. So any increase in output or demand would not lead to an increase in price. As output increases, the amount of spare capacity declines. There is the possibility of diminishing returns in production and potentially bottlenecks in production as we get closer and closer to producing the maximum that the economy can produce. By the time we get close to the full employment level of output, there may be shortages in resources, and so this starts to drive the price level up. Prices of these resources start to rise, and so the price level starts to increase as we get closer to the end. So when AS becomes perfectly inelastic, the economy is at full capacity, which is equivalent to being on the PPF boundary. So here's a very different take on how the long-run aggregate supply curve looks. And the implication for this can be quite significant in terms of our understanding of government economics. So the Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve looks like this. Now in the classical version, the vertical line, we concluded that any change in aggregate demand would only change the price level. But if we believe the long-run aggregate supply curve looks like this, then actually we might draw slightly different conclusions. So for example, if we imagine that aggregate demand, the level of aggregate demand in our economy is here, consistent with a level of output Y2. If there is an increase in aggregate demand, then actually that is not going to lead to an increase in the price level whilst we're still on the elastic part of the aggregate supply curve. All it will lead to is an increase in real GDP. So what we have here is an increase in demand can cause non-inflationary growth, can cause an increase in economic growth without an increase in the price level. If we now imagine that aggregate demand is greater in the economy and our level of output is closer to the full employment level of output, subsequent increases in aggregate demand lead to smaller increases in GDP and bigger increases in the price level, to the point where we reach the perfectly inelastic point of the aggregate supply curve, long aggregate supply curve. Any further increases in AD would only serve to increase the price level further. So what Keynes had discovered, or what he thought, was that when the economy is operating at very low levels of output, then actually aggregate demand can increase without any increase in the price level. However, as you get closer to the full employment level of output, there is a trade-off that increases in economic growth might also be met with increases in the price level. So there may be inflationary pressures as AD moves from AD3 to AD4 to AD5. So there may be sharper rises in the price level because AS is more inelastic as we get close to full capacity. So a comparison of the two viewpoints, and it might be worth taking a screenshot of this, printing it out and putting it in your notes. The classical view on the right-hand side said that in the long run, the economy should always revert to the full employment level of output. And any impact or any changes in demand will only lead to a change in the price level, not how much is being produced. The only way you can change how much is being produced is through supply measures, so only through changing the level of aggregate supply. The Keynesian view of how the economy works in the long run supply curve is quite different. In his view, actually, changes in aggregate demand can lead to increases in output as long as the economy is operating below its full employment level of output. Another implication of this is that the economy can stay below its full employment level of output for quite a significant period of time. It won't automatically revert back to the maximum level of output. And often it is the responsibility of governments to increase aggregate demand to ensure that the economy returns to the full employment level of output. So the government can play a key role in managing the economy by stimulating demand through fiscal policy. In the Keynesian view of the world, in the classical view of the world, the economy always converges rapidly on full employment, and so no manipulation of aggregate demand can have any effect except on the price level. So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by long-run aggregate supply. We've looked at the factors that influence the long-run aggregate supply curve and would cause it to shift. And then at the end, we looked at the difference between the classical and Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curves. Quite tricky economic theory, but the key fact is we can draw the difference between those two curves. Hope you're not feeling too like this. That's it. Thank you very much.